Jonathan Reed wandered the backstreets of the city, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn leather jacket, head bowed against the biting autumn wind. The narrow alleyways were a maze, the cobblestone streets slick with recent rain, the lamplight barely cutting through the thick, encroaching fog. Reed was lost in more ways than one, his thoughts a tangle of frustration, his mind a blank canvas stubbornly refusing to be filled. It had been months since he'd written anything of substance. The words that once flowed so easily now evaded him, leaving him adrift in a sea of failed ideas and crumpled paper. His last novel, a crime thriller that had garnered critical acclaim, felt like a distant memory, a success that now seemed impossible to replicate. With each passing day, the pressure mounted, suffocating his creativity and turning what was once a passion into a source of dread. Tonight was no different. He'd set out in the hope that the city's hidden corners might spark some long-forgotten inspiration, but instead, he found himself more disheartened than ever. The buildings loomed high on either side, their old brick facades casting shadows that seemed to close in on him, making the streets feel more like a labyrinth than an escape. Just as he was about to give up and head home, a small weathered sign caught his eye. Elias's Books and Curiosities. The letters were faded, the wood cracked, as though the sign had hung there for decades, ignored by time and passerby alike. Reed had walked this route countless times and had never noticed the shop before. It was almost as if it had appeared out of nowhere, waiting for him. Intrigued, he pushed open the creaking door, a bell jangling overhead to announce his arrival. The interior was just as he'd imagined, a treasure trove of forgotten tales, with shelves packed haphazardly from floor to ceiling, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and dust. The dim lighting barely reached the corners, creating an atmosphere of quiet mystery. Reed felt an odd sense of calm wash over him, a brief respite from the turmoil that had plagued him for so long. He wandered through the narrow aisles, his fingers brushing the spines of countless books, each one a potential portal to another world. Yet nothing seemed to catch his interest. The titles blurred together, their once gilded lettering faded with age, until he found himself at the back of the store, where a single table stood, cluttered with odds and ends. There, amidst the forgotten trinkets and tattered volumes, lay a small red notebook. It was unremarkable at first glance, its leather cover worn and frayed, the corners bent as if it had been carried in a pocket for too long. There was no title, no author's name embossed on the front, nothing to suggest what lay within. And yet, Reed felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as though the notebook was meant for him and him alone. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The leather was smooth under his fingers, and when he opened it, he found the pages were blank, a pristine white that seemed almost out of place in this dusty, forgotten shop. There was something about the notebook that intrigued him, something he couldn't quite put into words. It was as if the notebook was waiting, no, expecting, to be written in. "What do you think?" came a voice from behind him. Reed turned to see an elderly man standing in the shadows, his eyes twinkling with a knowing glint. The shopkeeper, Reed assumed. He had a wiry frame, his clothes hanging loosely as though he'd been wearing the same suit for decades. His gray hair was slicked back, and his face was lined with age, but there was a sharpness to his gaze that unsettled Reed. "It's interesting," Reed replied, trying to keep his voice casual. The shopkeeper nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "It's been here for quite some time. Surprised it hasn't found an owner before now." But then, some things just wait for the right person, don't they? Reed felt a chill run down his spine at the man's words. He didn't know why, but the idea that this notebook had been waiting for him, specifically him, made him uneasy. Still, the curiosity was too strong to ignore. "How much?" he asked, holding up the notebook. The shopkeeper's smile widened, but his eyes remained as sharp as ever. "For you, my friend, it's on the house. Consider it a gift." Reed hesitated. The man's generosity seemed too convenient, too calculated. But the words were out before he could stop himself. "Thank you." He left the store with the notebook clutched tightly in his hand, the shopkeeper's gaze lingering on his back as he stepped out into the night. The fog had thickened, wrapping around him like a shroud as he made his way back to his apartment. The city seemed different somehow, quieter, as though the very air held its breath in anticipation. Once home, Reed placed the notebook on his desk, staring at it as if expecting it to reveal its secrets on its own. But it remained still, silent, its blank pages patiently awaiting the touch of his pen. He poured himself a drink, the whiskey burning a trail down his throat as he tried to shake off the unease that had settled over him. Finally, unable to resist the pull any longer, he picked up his pen and opened the notebook. The pages were as pristine as before, untouched by time. Taking a deep breath, he began to write, the words flowing out of him with an ease he hadn't felt in months. But as he wrote, an odd sensation crept over him, a feeling of being watched, of being guided. The words seemed to take on a life of their own, the sentences forming in ways he hadn't intended, the ideas veering into darker territory than he had originally planned. It was as if the notebook itself was alive, its pages dictating the story rather than the other way around. Reed paused, staring down at the words on the page. They were his, but they weren't. A shiver ran through him, but he dismissed it as fatigue. He closed the notebook, placing it back on the desk with a sense of unease he couldn't quite explain. He told himself it was just his imagination, just a fluke. But deep down, something in him knew that this notebook was not just an ordinary notebook. It was something else entirely, something ancient, something powerful, and it had chosen him. The following days passed in a blur for Jonathan Reed, each one blending into the next as he became increasingly absorbed in the red notebook. The initial unease he had felt upon discovering it had given way to a compulsion that he couldn't explain, a need to write that overrode all else. The words came to him effortlessly now, as if the dam of his creativity had finally broken, flooding him with ideas and stories. For the first time in months, Reed felt alive, invigorated by the rush of inspiration. But something wasn't right. At first, the changes were subtle, barely noticeable unless one was looking for them. A phrase here, a sentence there, words that Reed didn't remember writing. He would sit down at his desk, pen in hand, and before he knew it, hours had passed, and the notebook was filled with pages of text he couldn't fully recall composing. The stories were darker than anything he had written before, tinged with a sense of foreboding that clung to him even after he had put the notebook away. One evening, as Reed was rereading his latest entry, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The story he had written was about a young woman who had been brutally murdered in her apartment, her body discovered by a neighbor who had heard strange noises coming from her unit the night before. The details were vivid, almost disturbingly so, and as Reed read the final lines, a sense of dread settled over him. The next morning, Reed was sipping his coffee and half listening to the news on the radio when a headline caught his attention. Woman found murdered in her apartment on Elm Street. His heart skipped a beat as the reporter detailed the crime. A young woman living alone, found dead under circumstances eerily similar to those he had written about the night before. Reed nearly dropped his coffee cup. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as he rushed to his desk, grabbing the notebook and flipping through the pages to the story he had written. The parallels were undeniable. The description of the victim, the layout of the apartment, even the manner of death. It was all there, written in his own hand. It couldn't be a coincidence. But what did that mean? Was it possible that the notebook had somehow predicted the crime? Or worse, had his writing somehow influenced reality? Reed's mind raced with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he had heard about the crime on the news earlier, subconsciously incorporating it into his story. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The story had come to him unbidden, as though the words had been whispered into his ear, compelled onto the page by some unseen force. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. Reed couldn't shake the feeling that the notebook was watching him, that it held some dark power over him. He tried to resist writing, but the urge was overwhelming, gnawing at him until he had no choice but to give in. Each time he opened the notebook, his hand moved of its own accord, the stories pouring out in a torrent of darkness. And each time something changed. The words he wrote twisted and transformed, reshaping themselves into narratives he hadn't intended. They were always dark, always filled with violence and despair, and always terrifyingly close to reality. It was as if the notebook was feeding off his fears, amplifying them into something tangible, something dangerous. One story was about a car accident, a man driving late at night, distracted by thoughts of his failing marriage, losing control on a slick road and crashing into a tree. The next day, Reed heard about a similar accident on the same stretch of road, the driver's life eerily mirroring the character he had created. Another story depicted a house fire, an entire family trapped inside with no hope of escape. That same week, a fire claimed the lives of a family in a nearby neighborhood. The notebook was no longer a tool for his creativity. It had become something far more sinister, something that twisted his thoughts into dark premonitions that bled into the real world. Reed tried to stop using the notebook, but every attempt was thwarted. His laptop froze whenever he tried to type. His old typewriter jammed, refusing to budge. Even the pens he used with other notebooks seemed to dry up as soon as he began to write. It was as if the red notebook had become his only outlet, the sole means through which he could express himself, and it was slowly driving him mad. Panic gripped him as he realized the depth of his predicament. He couldn't just throw the notebook away. It had a hold on him that he couldn't break. The thought of destroying it crossed his mind, but the very idea filled him with a strange, paralyzing fear, as though the notebook would fight back if he tried. In the darkest moments of the night, when the world outside was quiet and still, Reed would sit at his desk, the notebook open in front of him, and wonder what had possessed him to ever pick it up. The stories it wrote were no longer his. They belonged to the notebook, each one a piece of a larger puzzle that he was only beginning to comprehend. And the more he wrote, the more he realized that the notebook wasn't just writing stories. It was rewriting his life, one dark chapter at a time. The final straw came one night when Reed was working late, the city outside his window shrouded in darkness. He had written a story about a man who was slowly driven insane by a cursed object, his mind unraveling until he could no longer distinguish between reality and fiction. As he penned the last words, a wave of exhaustion washed over him, and he laid his head on his desk, the notebook still open beneath his hand. When he awoke, the story had changed. The man in the story was no longer a fictional character. He was Jonathan Reed, a writer who had found a mysterious notebook that slowly consumed him, its dark power seeping into every aspect of his life until there was nothing left but madness. Reed stared at the page, his heart pounding in his chest. The notebook had begun writing about him, and he knew with a bone-deep certainty that there was no escape. The notebook had chosen him, and it wasn't done with him yet. With trembling hands, Reed closed the notebook and shoved it into his desk drawer, trying to shut out the voice in his head that whispered of the story still waiting to be told. He couldn't keep writing, but he couldn't stop either. The notebook had become a part of him, a dark, twisted mirror reflecting his deepest fears and darkest thoughts. And as much as he tried to deny it, Reed knew that the worst was yet to come. Jonathan Reed was a man unraveling. Days turned into nights and nights bled into days, all without distinction. The boundaries of time blurred, just as the line between reality and the stories he wrote in the red notebook began to disappear. His apartment, once a refuge from the world, now felt like a prison, a claustrophobic space where the walls seemed to close in on him, where the air was thick with the scent of fear and desperation. The notebook had become his obsession, his curse. Reed could no longer resist its pull, no longer deny the strange power it held over him. Every attempt to distance himself from it only ended in failure. He had tried to leave the apartment, to take a walk through the city and clear his mind, but every step led him back to his desk, to the waiting pages that demanded to be filled. It was as though the notebook had woven itself into the very fabric of his life, its influence inescapable. Reed's writing had taken on a new urgency, a fevered intensity that frightened him. The stories that poured from his pen were darker, more twisted than ever before, vivid depictions of violence, madness, and despair that left him shaking with a terror he could not explain. And each time the stories felt less like fiction and more like memories, as though he was merely recording events that had already happened, or worse, that were destined to happen. He tried to talk himself out of this madness, to convince himself that it was all just a series of coincidences, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and stress. But deep down, he knew better. The notebook was no ordinary object. It was something far older, far more powerful. It was shaping his thoughts, guiding his hand, leading him down a path he could not escape. The final breaking point came one night when Reed was jolted awake by a nightmare so vivid, so horrifying, that it left him gasping for breath. In the dream, he had been sitting at his desk, writing furiously in the notebook, his hand moving of its own accord as words flowed across the page. But when he looked closer, he saw that the ink was not ink at all, but blood, his blood seeping from the tip of the pen, staining the pages with each word he wrote. He had awakened in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, only to find the nightmare spilling over into reality. The notebook was open on his desk, filled with words he didn't remember writing, words that described his own demise in gruesome detail. His hands shook as he read the final lines, detailing the moment when he, Jonathan Reed, would lose his mind completely, succumbing to the madness that had been festering inside him. It was too much. Reed snapped the notebook shut, throwing it across the room in a fit of rage and fear. It landed with a dull thud, the pages ruffling slightly before settling into a silence that seemed to mock him. He couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the paranoia, the sense that his life was no longer his own. It was driving him to the brink of insanity. He needed to get out, to escape the suffocating grip of the notebook, to find a way to break free before it was too late. But as he staggered to his feet, the room seemed to tilt and spin, the walls closing in on him. The floor beneath him wavered, and he had to grab the edge of the desk to steady himself. He was trapped not just in his apartment, but in his own mind, a mind that was slowly crumbling under the weight of the horrors it had been forced to conceive. Reed stumbled into the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face in a desperate attempt to clear his head. But the reflection that stared back at him from the mirror was that of a stranger. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale and clammy, his hair disheveled. The man in the mirror looked haunted, a ghost of the confident writer he had once been. His thoughts were jumbled, incoherent. How had it come to this? How had he, a rational man, fallen so far? It was the notebook. He knew that much. But what was it? Where had it come from? And why had it chosen him? He had no answers, only a growing sense of dread that there was something far darker at play than he could comprehend. He tried to piece together the timeline of events, to make sense of the chaos that had overtaken his life. But the more he thought about it, the more the details slipped away, like sand through his fingers. The notebook was erasing his memories, rewriting his thoughts until all that remained was the fear, the madness, and the stories that now consumed him. Reed knew he had to destroy the notebook, but the very thought filled him with an inexplicable terror. He had tried before, tried to burn it, drown it, tear it apart, but each attempt had ended in failure. The notebook was indestructible, impervious to any force he could muster. It seemed to feed off his attempts to rid himself of it, growing stronger, more insistent, with each failed effort. And now, as he stood in the bathroom, his reflection taunting him from the mirror, Reed knew there was only one way this could end. The notebook was winning. It had taken control of his life, his mind, his very soul, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The stories he wrote were no longer just stories, they were prophecies, and each one brought him closer to the inevitable conclusion. He stumbled back to his desk, drawn once again to the notebook despite his terror. He knew what it wanted, what it was pushing him toward. The final story, the last chapter of his life. The notebook was ready, the pages waiting, and Reed could no longer resist. With trembling hands, he picked up the pen, his mind a haze of fear and despair. He tried to fight it, to push back against the compulsion that had taken hold of him, but it was no use. His hand moved on its own, the pen gliding across the page as the story unfolded. It was a story about a man named Jonathan Reed, a writer who had been driven mad by a cursed notebook, a man who had tried to escape, who had tried to destroy the thing that was destroying him, but who had ultimately failed. The words flowed from him in a torrent, each sentence bringing him closer to the end. As he wrote, Reed could feel the madness closing in, could hear the whispers growing louder, urging him on. The room seemed to fade away, the world outside receding until there was nothing left but the notebook and the story it demanded. He was no longer in control, no longer the author of his own life. He was merely a vessel, a conduit for the darkness that had claimed him. The final sentence appeared on the page, written in his own hand but not his own words. And with that, Jonathan Reed knew there was no escape, for the story had already been written, and his fate was sealed. Reed dropped the pen, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the realization hit him. The story was over. His story was over. The notebook had won. He slumped back in his chair, his eyes glazed and unfocused. The room was silent, the air thick with the oppressive weight of what he had just done. The notebook lay open on the desk, its pages filled with the story of his descent into madness, the story of his end. And Reed, broken and defeated, knew that there was nothing left for him now. The descent was complete. The madness had consumed him. All that remained was the final chapter. Jonathan Reed sat in his darkened apartment, the silence so thick it felt like a physical presence, pressing down on him, suffocating him. The notebook lay open on his desk, the pages filled with the story of his life, a story that he no longer had any control over. The final chapter was written, but the end had not yet come. He could feel it, though, looming just out of reach like a storm gathering on the horizon, ready to crash down and wash away the last remnants of his sanity. The words in the notebook had sealed his fate, and he knew with a bone-deep certainty that there was no escape. The notebook had become his master, and he, its slave, trapped in a cycle of horror that would only end when the final sentence was written. The room felt colder now, the shadows deeper, as if the darkness itself was alive, feeding off his fear. Reed's hand trembled as he reached for the pen, the same pen he had used to write so many stories, each one bringing him closer to this moment. The metal was cold against his skin, an icy reminder of the inevitable. The notebook was patient, waiting, as it always did, for him to finish what he had started. Reed knew that he could try to resist, try to hold on to the last shreds of his will, but it would be futile. The notebook would win, as it always had, as it always would. The story had already been written, after all, and all that was left was for Reed to accept it. With a resigned sigh, he picked up the pen, his movements slow, deliberate, as though he was performing a ritual. He knew what was coming, and yet there was a strange sense of calm that settled over him as he prepared to write the final words. Perhaps it was the relief of knowing that the torment would soon be over, or perhaps it was simply the last vestiges of his sanity slipping away. Either way, Reed no longer cared. The first word appeared on the page, and Reed's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't his hand that moved the pen, but something else, something that had taken control of him, of his life, and now guided his every action. The pen scratched across the paper, the sound harsh in the stillness of the room, each letter forming with a dreadful inevitability. Jonathan Reed knew his time had come. Reed's hand moved faster now, the words pouring out of him in a frantic rush, as if the notebook could no longer wait to see the story completed. He felt detached from his own body, an observer rather than a participant, as the sentences took shape before his eyes. Each one was a hammer blow, driving him further into the depths of despair. He could feel the cold embrace of death creeping closer, its fingers brushing against his skin, leaving a trail of icy fear in their wake. The darkness was closing in, wrapping around him like a shroud, suffocating him, dragging him down into the abyss. Reed's vision blurred, the words on the page swimming before his eyes, but still his hand moved, the pen unstoppable. He could hear the whispers again, the voices that had haunted him for so long growing louder, more insistent. They urged him on, urging him to finish, to complete the story, to bring the nightmare to its inevitable conclusion. There was no escape, no salvation. The notebook had claimed him, body and soul, and now it demanded the final sacrifice. Jonathan Reed, the writer who had once been so full of life, so full of hope, was now nothing more than a pawn in a game he could never hope to win. The last sentence was upon him, and Reed felt a sudden surge of panic, a desperate urge to stop, to throw the pen aside and run, but it was too late. The notebook held him in its grip, and he was powerless to resist. His hand moved of its own accord, the pen pressing down harder, the letters forming with a finality that made his heart pound in his chest. And as the final word was written, Jonathan Reed felt his life slip away, his soul consumed by the darkness, his story ended. The pen fell from his hand, clattering onto the floor as Reed slumped back in his chair, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The room was silent once more, the only sound the faint rustle of paper as the last page of the notebook settled. It was over. The story was complete. Reed's story was complete. But as he stared at the notebook, something shifted, a subtle change that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The pages began to turn on their own, flipping backward, faster and faster, until they reached the very beginning. The first blank page stared up at him, pristine and untouched, as if the story had never been written. And then slowly, agonizingly slowly, words began to appear on the page, forming the title of a new story. The first story, the story of how it all began. The red notebook wasn't done. It was starting over, rewriting the past, preparing to claim its next victim. Jonathan Reed's story might have ended, but the notebook's story would never end. It would continue, as it always had, waiting patiently for the next writer to find it, to open it, to begin the cycle anew. The notebook was eternal, its power unending, and it would always find a way to write the final chapter. Reed's body slumped forward, his forehead resting on the cold surface of the desk, the last vestiges of life draining from him. The red notebook lay open beside him, its blank pages ready, waiting. And somewhere, out there in the world, another writer was walking down a narrow street, passing by a small, almost hidden bookstore, unaware that their story was about to begin. The end had come, but the story was far from over. The red notebook waited, and its next chapter was about to be written.